recommendations that are going to be released either today or tomorrow, and will be presented to the committee on Monday. And the City Council Committee on Governance Reform could be voting on these things as soon as September 18th. And it looks like we've got a solid room right now, and it is almost 10:05. So I think we're ready to get started. Just a quick introduction. My name is Rob Kwan with Unrig LA, and really appreciate you joining us here today. As said earlier, there is a link in the chat where you can find the materials that we're going to be talking about today. A recording is being taken of this conversation right now, and we're working to make sure that that is up and alive for you by the end of the day. I want to make sure that we talk about the poll results, which is why you're here. I just want to say that, the biggest question we've had outstanding is, are voters going to accept more politicians? And this is something that has been put into serious question given the ongoing laundry list of corruption scandals that have engulfed City Hall. There's been a lot of reservation and doubt as to whether voters are going to be willing to entertain something like this. And unfortunately, that has resulted in convenient excuses for some who can say, oh, we can't expand the council that big because voters won't support it. Or they decide that we need to put some sweeteners in there, like cutting their salaries in half, or cutting their staff in half, or imposing more strict term limits as ways to goad voters into supporting the thing. And what we're excited to see here is that voters, polls don't vote. We still got a lot to see, but voters might not be as big of a problem as our elected officials, who are going to be deciding what they actually send to voters. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Trent Lang from the California Clean Money Campaign. He's going to give some brief remarks, and then I'll give you a little bit of background as far as how we put together the resources to get this poll going. And then we'll spend about 30 minutes hearing from Adam and John from FM3 Research, we are extremely grateful for all of their work and assistance on this thing. And we will have at least 15 minutes at the end to hear some questions. If you have anything that's coming up during this conversation, please feel free to drop it in the chat. As far as how we will take the questions, we are going to prioritize questions for FM3 Research at the front end. And then we will turn to any kind of broader questions on policy questions or anything else you might have. And again, I just want to really thank you and appreciate you for being engaged on something like this, and hand it over to Trent Lang.
All right, thank you very much, Rob, and thank you everybody for being here. Trent Lang, president of the California Clean Money Campaign. We a nonpartisan, a nonprofit focusing on the issues of campaign finance reform, campaign disclosure. We were sponsors of the California Disclose Act that made the top 3 funders have to show up on political ads, including in Los Angeles for independent expenditure and ballot measures. And here in Los Angeles, we were very proud to work with former council members Mike Bonin and David Rue to strengthen Los Angeles's current matching funds public financing system to make it a 6-to-1 match that matches only small donors. That has been, we think, extremely successful in boosting the power of small donors and helping Los Angeles have the most diverse city council it may have ever had. The rest of the state has taken notice, which is why we're working on 2 bills to put a measure on the November 2024 ballot to repeal the ban on public financing in non-charter cities. So the rest of California can follow Los Angeles's lead, SB 24 and AB 270, those bills are. But as good as it is, LA's partial matching fund system isn't enough. It doesn't provide quite enough. It doesn't provide enough funds to stop candidates from having to spend so much time fundraising, and many regular voters can't participate because they don't even have small donations to give. So that's why we're very pleased that one of the things that this poll looks at and will report on is whether voters would support expanding California to have democracy dollars, democracy vouchers. Seattle and Oakland have these systems where every adult resident in the city gets 4 $25 vouchers that they can give to the qualified candidate of their choice as long as they accept donations. It's been a very powerful system in Seattle, really increased engagement. So lots of people like that. So we're very excited to see the poll results in this that Adam and them will be talking about to show how strongly voters support those ideas, including the possibility that the city legislative analyst is studying not only feasibility of that, but in making it a full public funding system with vouchers and hybrid grants. This is part of the poll. We're also very excited about the different other reforms that council is looking at: ranked choice voting, independent redistricting, city council expansion. All of this poll will, as you'll see, have very strong results from Los Angeles voters. We're really glad that city council is already studying them and the possibility of putting them on the ballot so LA voters can choose to pass them. And we think that these results will really show to them and other city leaders how important it is that they act swiftly and work with reform leaders and city leaders and other stakeholders to make sure these get put on the ballot. With that, thank you very much for being here. We're excited to see these results.
Great. And just a few notes about this poll. I want to really thank Mike Draskovich from LA for Democracy Vouchers. This would not have happened without him. It took a lot of work as far as wrangling together input from people as well as the resources to get this thing together. This poll cost about $45K, and $15K came from the Piper Fund, which has supported past democracy voucher efforts in Seattle and Oakland. $15K from Represent Us, and then the remaining $15K came from a few individuals who strongly support good governance reform measures. And Adam, you should be able to ask to share screen. We are ready to go to our next phase of things.
Great. And John, maybe you want to kick things off for us and kind of summarize where we start?
Yeah, John Fairbank, I'm partner in FM3 Research. We're excited to be working on this important project, important issue. Let me just say quickly, you're going to see results here that Adam's going to walk through. This is clearly a reform that is the right time, the right place, and the right issues of change and reform. It's a very strong set across the board. There is clearly a perceived need to reform city government and city elections. Voters are clearly paying attention to this issue. Hard to miss with all the issues over the last months and years. So voters are clearly paying attention to this. The specifics element of the reforms we tested are pulled very strongly, and we saw support across all demographics. Demographics across the board, council districts across the board, just a uniform set of positive results. So with that, Adam, you want to walk through this and we'll present this to everybody.
Yeah, we'll give everyone a chance to see the results. I'm Adam Sonnenschein, Senior Vice President at FM3. As a disclaimer for those who've been in charter reform and government reform in LA, you probably recognize the last name. Just as a disclaimer, Rafe Sonnenschein is my uncle, but we talk all the time. I talked to him this morning, but we didn't talk about this poll, and he didn't have input into the poll. He's got his own process going on. As Rob mentioned, this was done by different stakeholders, so just want to make sure that's clear for everybody. So let me give everybody a sense of the methodology of what we did with this poll. We were in the field just about a month ago, July 15th to the 23rd. Of this year. The survey sample and research population is likely November 2024 voters in the city of LA. Those with a voting history that would indicate they're likely to vote. We did 826 survey interviews, a good sample for a citywide survey, and that 826 includes some small oversamples of African American and API voters, which we weighted back to the expected proportion. So in the end, the data is reflective of the demographics of the likely 2024 universe in the city, but we were able to get a little bit better precision in our estimates of the attitudes of African American and API voters. Questions asked of everybody of the full sample have a margin of error plus or minus 3.7%, a little bit higher when you have questions asked of half of the respondents. And you'll see throughout the survey, there's some times where we played with different types of descriptions and language where half the voters heard one question and half heard something different. We did this survey through multiple contact methods to give people different options to participate and hopefully make the poll as representative as possible. So we did telephone calls with live telephone interviewers, both landlines and cell phones. And we sent email messages and text messages, which led to an online survey. Folks could do one or the other, so it's not counting the same person 2 different times. They did it by the phone and online. And the online is not one of these online surveys that like goes up on a social media site and all your friends can take it, or you can take it 50 times. It's protected, so each person who's randomly invited to take the survey could take it 1 time, and that's it. Survey was available in English and Spanish, and you might see at some point something doesn't quite add up to 100% or the number you're expected because we've rounded decimal points. So let's start with one of the big picture issues that John was just mentioning, and that's the interest in reform in the city. You can see the actual question we asked here in italics at the top of the slide. Do you think there's a major need, some need, just a little need, or no real need for reforms too? On the left, you can see reform to the LA city government, an overwhelming sense and broad agreement that there's a need to reform city government. 81% would say a major or some need. Just 5% would say no real need, and 6% don't have an opinion. So 94% of people have a view here, and the vast majority of those would say there's a need to reform city government. Strongly held view on the right-hand side about the need to reform city elections, 67% to 28%. Not quite as strong as the overall view on city government, but still 2/3 who would say there's a need to reform city elections. A question here that we asked people about influence in city government. And influence over elected officials. In this case, if your eyes are good enough, you can read the question at the bottom of the slide. Do you think people like you have too much influence, about the right amount of influence, or too little influence over elected officials in the city? Not surprisingly, but you can see large majorities would say people like them have too little influence, 71%, and only 14% feel like they have about the right amount of influence, 9% would say too much. When you ask them about big money campaign contributors or special interests, you get not just the opposite result, but even stronger, particularly on big money campaign contributors. Speaking to some of the issues Trent was referring to, 84% of voters say those kinds of people have too much influence over elected officials in the city. Special interests in general, 71% would say too much influence. And again, very few people who don't have opinions on these kinds of questions. They may not know all the details of what's been going on in the city, but they have a sense of these kinds of things. Okay, one of the ways that we wanted to gauge attitudes on reform was through drafting a hypothetical ballot measure. We know that some of these issues, and many of them, if they were to be implemented, would be done at the ballot. And so we drafted a couple of variations of reform-based ballot measures. And one of the things you're going to see in this survey presentation overall is that we're testing several different issues and in different ways. So here I'm going to show you the text of the ballot measure that we drafted as a way to get reactions on some different kinds of reforms. And we actually tested 2 little variations, and I'll show you the first one here. This would be a ballot question that describes a series of reforms, such as establishing ranked choice voting, increasing disclosure on political advertising, lowering campaign contributions, the voluntary program for public campaign financing through $100 in vouchers. That's something that Trent was just referring to, that democracy dollars, democracy vouchers idea, additional resources to the Ethics Commission. And then, as many of you know, this upcoming year, right on the ballot question itself that voters are going to see, they're going to see some of the supporters and opponents of that measure. And so to some degree, we wanted to simulate that. Now, we don't have a list of official supporters and opponents because this is a hypothetical ballot measure. So instead, what we did is hedge this with supporters may include, and then we mentioned some people who have supported similar reforms at a state level and similar opponents at a state level. So meant to just kind of give a sense of flavor of what may be coming. Again, we don't know exactly who's going to be supportive of or opposing an actual ballot measure. Here's the other variation we tested. It doesn't mention ranked choice voting, but instead it mentions further restrictions on former city officials from acting as lobbyists. So trying to look at some different opportunities here and different ballot measures related to ethics, elections, and government reform. Here's the reaction to those two ballot measure questions. Again, hypothetical questions early in the process, but it helps to get an initial read here. What we see is in both cases, the measures have 2/3 support. This is among the full sample of likely November 2024 voters. We further parse that out. You can see definitely yes, probably yes. If they were initially undecided, we're asking if they're leaning yes or leaning no. If they're no, we say, is that definitely no or probably no? So you can see the variations in intensity. And one of the things that kind of jumps out is the strong definitely yes compared to definitely no here, more than 2-to-1, and more than 3-to-1 in the overall, if you're looking at the total yes to total no in both versions. There's a small benefit to talking about the lobbying restrictions on former elected officials. As you can imagine, that's a very popular potential reform. But between 67 and 70, statistically, not a lot of difference. So in both cases, we're seeing good, strong results on this kind of, again, hypothetical ballot measure that could be moved forward in the upcoming year. One of the things that we found very interesting is looking at the likely March electorate. A little bit older group of voters, also paying a little more attention to what's going on. They're a little more engaged. They're showing up to vote in primary elections. They're a little less likely to be undecided and more likely to have strong opinions. And in both cases here, we're seeing a little bit higher support among likely March voters than even likely November voters. So among March voters, 71% said that they would support the version of the measure that includes ranked choice voting. 73% would support the measure as it includes lobbying restrictions. And again, both of these versions include all that language you saw, the democracy vouchers or democracy dollars idea, along with some of the other ethics restrictions and reforms. John mentioned broad support for many of these items, and here you get a sense of the interest in this kind of measure by age. Now, this is going back to the full sample, the likely November 2024 voters, but here we've got the breakdown by age from 18 to 29, 30 to 39, up to voters who are ages 65 plus. And what's so interesting here and different from many, many other issues is the consistency and the level of support, where the strongest supporting age group is at 75% yes, and the one who has the least support among all of these has 65% support. So we're really only talking about a difference of 10 points. And you can follow along at the bottom, you can see the percentage of the sample or the percentage of likely voters who fall into each of these age brackets. But just interesting to note, really across the board, the percentage who said they would support this measure is nearly at 2/3 and pretty consistent.
Not too many issues we pull on these days that have the 18 to 29-year-olds and the 65 pluses agreeing.
Mm-hmm. Looking at this by political ideology, progressive voters, and this is self-identified, progressive voters off the charts supportive, 84%. Liberal voters also very, very strong and support at 78%. And you'll notice, if you look at the percentage of the sample here, that's half the voters in the city of LA who are defining themselves as either progressive or liberal. You look at the nearly 1/3 of voters who would call themselves moderates, and you're still at 60% support. And then the relatively small group of voters in the city who consider themselves conservative are actually basically evenly divided here. So you're not seeing a big opposition from any political ideological group. By gender, again, speaking to consistency, women support this a little more than men, but both men and women supporting the measure at very, very high levels. And then by race and ethnicity, white voters among the strongest, Latino voters, API voters, all pretty equal in their strong support for the measure at 70%. African-American voters also supportive at 60%, a little bit higher don't know, a little bit higher no vote, but still more than 2-to-1 yes to no. And we've often found in city measures in LA that African-American voters might start a little bit lower, and then as they hear arguments from both sides, tend to move to the kind of more progressive liberal side in these elections.
And again, one of the reasons we think that a little stronger support in March election is because the whites and Asians who are going to be higher percentages of that March vote you can see how strong they are.
And then geographically, we don't, with 15 council districts, really have enough of a sample to break down each council district individually. So we've grouped them into zones or regions here, but without digging into the details too much, the first thing to just take away is all of the voters, all of these zones are at 61% or above in who are favoring this hypothetical measure. And the strongest support is coming in some different kinds of communities. So the west side or hills areas, which we're defining as the council districts 5 and 11, also East LA with council districts 1 and 14, and then a little bit surprisingly in the harbor area. All three of those are, about 3/4 or above who are supportive. And really, again, we're talking about variations in support with no part of the city showing any sort of strong opposition to this ballot measure.
Again, you can just see how low the undecideds are across the board. Everybody has an opinion, a view of this.
Okay, so we wanted to also break this down and look at some of the individual reform proposals, some of that are mentioned in that ballot measure and some other ideas. So here I'm going to show you a first view, and the way to look at this is the dark blue here is showing you strong support, the light blue is somewhat support, then you have somewhat opposed in the kind of pinkish light red, strong opposed in the dark red, and then don't know in gray, and then we've totaled up the support and oppose on the right-hand side. So here's a quick question about independent redistricting, requiring an independent panel of LA residents to be responsible for drawing and finalizing city council boundaries. That's got very, very strong support, almost 80%, low opposition, and about 10% who don't know. When it comes to ranked choice voting, you saw it mentioned in that ballot question, the kind of hypothetical ballot question. We also isolated it here in two different variations. One with a very simple description and one with a little more detail. And in both cases, there's support in the low 70s, opposition around 20%, don't know, 10% or less, whether we give this more detailed description at the bottom or the simplified one in the middle of the slide. In both cases, good, strong numbers for the idea of ranked choice voting.
Adam, just really quickly, we had a question about the previous slides where you broke down some of the responses on slides 12 through 15.
Yeah.
The question was, are all these data points related to the hypothetical measure with or without RCV included?
They're combined. So with the differences only being a couple points between the two measures, and I'm going back here so you can see this. With it being 67 to 70, 21, 17, we just combine them to look at the demographics in total. So we had a larger sample to review. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we were here. Finally, Rob, we're at council expansion because this is where we kind of started, and here we are in the presentation, and we'll have some more detail on this later. You can see we asked about two options here, going from 15 to 23 and from 15 to 29, and this is all the information that was provided. Okay, just want to be clear about that. This is exactly how it was presented to people. There was no other sort of prelude or preface to that. You can see the question at the bottom, right? Proposals that can be considered to change LA city government or the way elections are conducted. Please tell me if you'd support or oppose that proposal. On the issue of going from 15 to 23, you can see there's support at 62, oppose at 23, don't know at 14, and strong support's at 31 compared to strong oppose at 13. So more than 2 to 1 there. And more than 2 to 1, almost 3 to 1 in terms of total support and opposition for that idea. Moving from 15 to 29 also has majority support, also has 2 to 1 support, but a little bit softer, 55% support, a little bit higher in opposition at 27. And you can see the strong supports at 26, don't know is a little bit higher. We're going to dig into this more a little bit later in the presentation. Just wanted to give you that taste of things now. And then here's where we isolated this idea of democracy dollars or democracy vouchers. In these two examples here, we're talking about giving 4 certificates for $25 each or 4 vouchers for $25 each to support council campaigns or mayor, city attorney, city controller campaigns. You can see in both cases, those have majority support. The word vouchers consistently in the survey doesn't poll quite as well as certificates. As you can imagine, in some circles, vouchers have sort of a negative connotation as it relates to education. And that might be what's interplaying there, although we don't know for sure. But either way, for something that voters probably hadn't really ever heard of before, these are pretty good numbers, and we'll show you how that shakes out as they learn more about the proposal in a moment. Just focusing on independent redistricting, council expansion, and ranked choice voting. This is council expansion, again, combining the 23 and 29 options just to look at the demographic differences overall. Ranked choice voting, both descriptions combined to look at the demographics overall. You can see if you look in the column of independent redistricting, this is the percentage who support it. It was 78% overall based on the description we provided, and very consistent across age, gender, race, and ethnicity. For council expansion, good support, majority support again across those categories, a little bit stronger among younger voters than those who are seniors, a little bit stronger among Latino and API voters, and to some degree African-American voters, but majorities really across the board. And then as it relates to ranked choice voting, again, pretty consistent here. We're not seeing, what we see in many other situations with, one demographic group at 30% support and another at 70 or 80. They're all within a reasonable range of each other.
Again, you can see consistent differences here. The support for government reform, city government reform, and city council election reform is a little different. Both strong, but this is a theme throughout that separates a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And then here we look at the variation by, again, those LA city zones we went through earlier, so you can see some of the geographic variation. As it relates to independent redistricting, everybody is supportive at nearly equal levels. Council expansion, a little bit of variation within that West Valley area, but for the most part, you're looking at mid-40s to mid-60s in terms of support throughout the city. And ranked choice voting, not a lot of geographic variation, although East LA is a little bit stronger and downtown's a little bit weaker, but we're within kind of range of each other. And then again, isolating these proposals among voters likely to vote in the March election, the primary election. Independent redistricting is even a couple points stronger. Council expansion and ranked choice voting basically equal to where they are among general election voters. Okay, let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on democracy dollars. You could call them democracy vouchers or certificates, but all kind of thinking about the same idea. Here's a question we're asking people if each of these aspects of the proposal would make them more likely, or how much more likely would make them to support that proposal. Very likely, somewhat likely, not too likely, not at all likely, or in the gray, they don't know. And we're seeing high percentages who are saying they're more likely to support democracy dollars when they hear that there's some additional ethics protections and protections against fraud and misuse of funds. So additional resources for the Ethics Commission, requiring that the candidates use the funds for legitimate campaign purposes, not personal spending, prohibiting the funds being used by residents for purposes other than supporting candidates. So both of those kind of relate to the idea of fraud prevention. And that the proposal would not require an increase in taxes would obviously be a big plus to many voters. Continuing on the same question, that candidates would have to agree to limits on campaign donations to get the democracy dollar donations. They have to get a sufficient number of signatures and small donations to show that they qualify. You're seeing these all kind of in the either 70s or now we're kind of in the mid 60s in terms of this would make you very likely or somewhat more likely to support the idea of democracy dollars. Allowing residents to use their certificates or vouchers for either ballot measures or candidate campaign. It's about 64% say that would make them more likely. And then requiring that the candidates get a set number of vouchers and be prohibited from raising any other private donations after qualifying to receive some limited public campaign grants so that they could run competitive campaigns. That one also kind of ends in the mid 60s in terms of making you more likely to support the idea of democracy dollars. We also provided some pro and con messaging. here's some of the top scoring reasons or themes that could be provided in terms of specifically democracy dollars. So we're not talking about the ballot measure overall or some of the other proposals that we talked about earlier, simply on democracy dollars. How convincing is this to you as a reason to support the proposal? Dark blue is very convincing. Light blue is somewhat convincing. We've added that up on the right-hand side. You can see several of these themes are really strong, 84% saying that they would find them convincing, with over 50% saying very convincing. We're generally, when we're doing kind of message testing for ballot measures, we're looking in the wanting to find things over at least 40% and very convincing. And here we have several that are over 50. Top themes here, just the need for reform and change and the kind of scandals that have befallen the council over recent months and years. The over-influence of wealthy special interests on city government, and that the proposal would limit their power and put it in the hands of regular voters. And that politicians just spend too much time fundraising and not enough time dealing with the real priorities. They've got to get out of the fundraising game and back to serving people. We also,
again, big picture government reform.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that you'll notice is many of these are kind of big picture issues that relate back to that original point about the need for reform of LA city government. We also provided the downsides, the opposition argument that you're likely to hear, which is, this is taking money away from programs and services that should be funded with city government and give it to politicians to run campaigns. We're using our money now to fund TV ads, and there's other issues, other priorities, and the money's going to get wasted. The kinds of things that generally tend to come up when there's any kind of public financing initiative that moves forward in a community. But we're tracking the support and opposition for the democracy dollar proposal after those positive themes and then after the negatives. So you can see how voters react to that. Again, whether we called it certificates or vouchers combined, it's at 50% support, 37 opposed, 13 who were unsure. After some positive messaging, you saw an example of a few of those. Support jumps pretty significantly up to 63%, down to 30% for opposition. You can see the don't know drops to 6%. We give opponents their best shot to knock down the proposal with the kind of arguments we assume that they would be using. And support for the idea remains quite strong at 59% support to 32% opposed, 9% who don't know. We've done our best to, kind of knock down the idea with the arguments that we expect would come after it. And it withstands and holds a pretty strong level of support, particularly for something that we mentioned earlier that voters probably had not heard a lot about before starting this survey. Okay, some more detail on council expansion, just as we did for democracy dollars. We also provided some pro and con statements here. You can see in blue the kind of supportive statement, and there are two variations here. So not everybody heard that entire long paragraph. Basically, everybody heard the sentences up to this parentheses, then half followed through to where it says split sample B. The other half skipped split sample A and just went to split sample B. So the arguments in favor are the ones that we're hearing a lot in the community, and that many members of the coalition are talking about, which is that it's just too many. 15 council districts can't represent the diversity of LA. Some neighborhoods are going to get overlooked. Again, half the people heard a kind of a reference to New York and Chicago and the way that their councils work. Others heard a different argument talking about large districts concentrating power and a culture of corruption. The opposition message is, again, what we would expect to hear and what has come up in the past when council expansion has been discussed in the city, and that this is just increasing the number of politicians. It's going to cost us more in salary, staff. It's hard enough to get anything done. If we expand the council, it's just going to make the problems worse. So then we re-asked the interest in council expansion for both 23 and 29 members. And you can see the results here at the top of the slide. You're looking at the initial opinions and the opinions after that, that pro and con statement on 23. So started at 62 to 23, support opposed, went to 64-29. So basically holds a pretty consistent pattern. Fewer voters are undecided as they learn a little bit more. Both the strong support and goes up 3 points, strong opposition goes up 2. Basically, this holds at a strong level, more than 2-1, when both sides have an opportunity to communicate. On the 29-member expansion, you see that that started at 55-27, goes up to 59% support. Opposition does go up as well as the don't knows decline, but basically in both cases, you've got almost 60% or more than 60% support, whether you're talking about 23 members or 29. So a few conclusions, and then we'll stop to take some of the questions that I'm sure are building up in the chat. Overall, very clear appetite for reform in the city. Over 80% see a need to reform city government. 2/3 see a need to reform city elections. That hypothetical government reform ballot measure has initial support of around 2/3. The survey did not explore pro and con messaging on that measure, so this is sort of a first look at that possibility. But both the text could be edited and changed, circumstances could change, so this is not to say that's the final proposal that could go before voters. It's got broad support, though, across age groups, geographic groups, gender, racial, and ethnic subgroups, and even stronger support among higher propensity voters. Voters like the concept of democracy dollars, and particularly as they hear more about it. After positive messages, it goes up to 63% who support the concept, which only drops a few points with a negative message. Nearly 80% of city voters support independent redistricting. Over 70% support ranked choice voting with either a simple or detailed description. And then, as you just saw, council expansion also has majority support, which is really maintained with pro and con messaging. The proposal to expand to 23 members has somewhat more support than 29, both before and after messages. And I'll just say we did not try to dig into any of the more nuanced variations of, add 4 more districts plus several more at large or regional or something else. This was just a straight based on the number from 15 to 23 or 15 to 29. So Rob and Trent and company, I think we'll stop there and happy to answer whatever questions we can.
Awesome. Thank you, and beautiful timing. We've got more than enough time for questions. So if you have anything brewing, please feel free to drop it in the chat, or if you'd also like to just pose it yourself, you can raise your hand. First question was from Samir Bitar. Apologies if I'm getting your name wrong. The question was, can you share the response rates per contact method?
Response rates per contact method, I can. So we had, usually that's right here. It's around 50-50, but I'll have to check. I thought I had it on the document right in front of me, but I don't. If you give me a few moments, I'll look that up.
All good. The next one was from Liz from the LA Public Press. Can you talk about the rate of people who agreed to do the survey? And the second question was, how long did the survey take to do?
Yeah, so the average respondent took about 20 minutes to do the survey when they responded by phone, and a little less when they did it online. As you can imagine, when someone is just reading the questions themselves instead of having to dialogue with somebody else, it goes by a little quicker. I don't know offhand the exact response rate. I know that generally speaking, we're calling or emailing several thousand people because most people don't pick up the phone and they don't answer an email or a text message. But that once people get engaged in taking the survey, they tend to respond. And when we looked at the response rates and the issues that we were seeing, is very consistent with other surveys going on in the city and the county and the state that we do.
And Samir, Liz, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Our next question was from Dave Zonizer from the LA Times. The first one was, did the survey provide respondents with a definition of what a special interest is?
No, dude, that's a good question, but it was just what you saw on the screen. It just says, do special interests have too much influence, not enough, or about right, without any further explanation of what that might be. And
he had a follow-up question, which I believe the answer is no. If so, were the public sector unions made as part of the definition, private sector unions, large
Yeah.
nonprofit organizations?
Yeah, no, in this case, we don't. And I think, David, you're talking about that question where we asked about influence of special interest. It just says special interest. It doesn't say anything more.
Thank you. And I see something else in the chat from Dave. I thought I saw a reference to lobbying reform on one of the slides early in the presentation. Apologies if I missed. But was there a lobbying reform proposal included in the hypothetical ballot measure that I missed?
Yeah, so as you might have seen, there were two versions of the ballot measure that were tested. One included ranked choice voting amongst a series of other reforms, including the democracy dollars and other disclosure. And the other had the phrase further restrict former city officials from acting as lobbyists. So that's when we're showing the results, that's the version that says measure with lobbying restriction.
Great. And Trent, might be good to throw this next question to you. It's a policy question from Ashley Dawson. Where are the funds coming from for the democracy vouchers?
A good question. It wasn't specified in this poll, and I don't know if there's been any specification for Los Angeles. Los Angeles's current matching funds program comes, it's in the charter, an allocation a little over 3 million. I don't know what it is exactly, but $3 or $4 million a year that comes from the general fund to pay for the matching fund system. That would be one way of doing it. Seattle has a small property surcharge thing that they pay for. There's lots of different ways to pay for vouchers, and that would be up to the city to decide. But one of the key points with all these is that any sort of public financing program is such an incredibly teeny weeny portion of the budget that 3 to 4 million for the matching funds is nothing compared to the whole budget, but gives the voters a lot more confidence that wealthy interests aren't unduly influencing the decision-making process for the other 99.9% of the budget.
And that's a really important question. Anytime you're trying to do public financing of elections, the immediate question is how are you going to pay for it? And there's some places that decide not to specifically protect funding sources, and then you find politicians who all of a sudden pull the plug on the funding. Right. So it's really important that we have, protected funding for our public financing program. If there's a motion from the council right now entertaining this, it's pretty open-ended as far as, the specifics. Depending on what they went with there, we might need more funding resources to cover these costs. So that's part of the reason we included ranked choice voting in here, is ranked choice voting combined with the elimination of primaries would ensure that money can go a lot further because we would be having fewer elections. So that is one way that we could make the existing pool of money we have for public financing go a little bit further. I think the other thing that is being debated, and this is all open-ended, this is not to indicate anyone's particular preference, but at least for me personally, I'm most concerned about LA City Council. That is kind of the heart of our municipal government, and LA City Council elections are a lot cheaper than citywide elections, both in overall cost as well as expenses on the matching funds program. To give you an idea, a mayoral candidate can rack up about $1 million in public matching funds, whereas, you could pay for multiple council races for multiple candidates with that same amount of money. So this is something that is open-ended, but a really important question that does have a few different doors we could go down as far as solutions. We have about 10 minutes left. So if anybody has anything else. Dave Z had a question. I don't know, Dave, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask the question yourself. I don't want to, I hate having people come in to ask questions and not giving them the opportunity to pose it themselves. If you'd like to, you can feel free to unmute yourself now. He says he's fine. So the question was, why was the restriction on lobbying by former city officials proposed Was it in response to certain real-world incidents? And would it serve as an outright ban on lobbying by former city employees?
Well, I can just say in terms of the second part of the question, I don't know that the proposal was really detailed much in terms of the survey. It's just saying we're further restricting. So whether that would be an outright ban or an extension of limits, and I'm not sure if that was really a particular response to an issue or more of a understanding that voters are concerned about undue influence in general, and that is one of the ways that there's a concern about influence from lobbyists, special interests, and council members acting in that capacity. So I think that's where that came from.
And I'll just leap in there to say that extension was part of Oakland's measure that passed in the last election for vouchers. It's just an increase from the current lobbying restrictions from 1 year to 2 years, and nothing specific for Los Angeles. Just it's a common reform, and that was part of the package that passed in Oakland recently.
And there was another layer to Dave's question, as would it serve as an outright ban on lobbying by former city employees? I believe the assumption is no, just given some of the case law on this thing. The courts are permissive of kind of narrowly tailored restrictions on post service lobbying. So it would probably be something where that buffer of protection is increased, but not a complete lifetime ban in any kind of way. There was another question from Brett Shears. What's the most likely path to the ballot for these measures, individually, or collectively? City council vote only, or is signature gathering at all plausible? I would say at a minimum for the first two main proposals that city council is talking about right now, we can bet that independent redistricting is going to be on the ballot in 2024. There's a lot of question as far as where council's consensus will fall as they kind of navigate this process. But there is a strong indication from the council president publicly that he really wants to get this question on the ballot in 2024. That is the easy way as far as charter reform. Getting city council to put it on the ballot just takes 8 votes. The hard way would come from gathering signatures, as was asked. It would require a multi-million-dollar campaign, more than likely, just to get the signatures together. And around 400,000 signatures would be required. So that would be an extremely time and money intensive process. There are other ways to reform the charter. There's an elected commission. That's something that we had in the 90s. We also had an appointed commission in the 90s, and they were kind of forced to work against each other and then eventually together. The appointed commission option, neither of these is really great. They have pros and cons, but there has been some talk. I know that Councilmember Harris Dawson recently spoke to the Empowerment Congress and said that he had recently met with Mayor Bass about a charter reform commission and kind of opening things up and looking at things more broadly, and that she was talking to other council members about this. There have also been rumblings internally about interest in maybe looking a bit broader than these two particular issues. I would just say that, like, depending on implementation of things, it might be difficult for council to put them all together. Just to give you an example, if we were to create new district lines in time for the 2026 elections, it really wouldn't make sense to implement democracy vouchers in 2026. If we delayed council expansion till 2032, it might make a whole lot of sense to do that and do democracy vouchers so they could be implemented in 2026. So there might be different working puzzle pieces that could fit together, or maybe not. That's kind of the rough lay of the land. One of the questions that was included in this survey was, would you support the idea of having a citizens assembly come up with charter reform ideas? And there's been a lot of interest from some council members in looking towards cities like Portland, which have a periodic charter review commission where every 5-10 years they open things up, they look at it, and they send voters a bunch of options. So that is a way we can kind of get outside of the self-interest of city council and maybe get some of these reforms entertained down the line. There is quite clearly way too much in this thing that we put in front of you as far as the poll to put all in one ballot measure. We wouldn't want to see that happen, and you know, who knows what kind of issues with the, you know, legal concerns about the ability to do that might be. But this is just really helpful to get a feel for how these things might play out, what the best presentation might be, and to see, you know, kind of where our strengths and weaknesses are. Lisa has her hand up, so I will turn it to you, Lisa. You should be able to unmute yourself now. I apologize.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have two questions. One, I apologize. I think I missed what you had said, but how were you able to, if you were, the survey was online, how were you able to ensure that folks were, that respondents were likely voters?
Thank you. So good question. So the folks who received invitations to participate in the survey by email or text, we got their information through the County Registrar of Voters, working through Political Data Inc., PDI, who's the kind of premier voter data vendor in the state. So they've given us the contact information for voters, specifically likely voters, and they received the invitation and they can't send it to other people to take.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And my other question is, I was very intrigued by the fact that you tested two messages regarding city council size. But I don't think you went over the difference between those two messages, or I didn't see that. Could you share?
Yeah, I can explain that a little further. So hopefully I can reshare. Rob, would you mind letting me reshare my screen? I can show that question again.
Should be good to go.
Okay, so here. So Lisa, within this statement, there's actually two different statements.
Yes, I saw that. And that's what I found was very interesting.
Yeah, and then what's interesting further, and why we didn't actually show it on this next slide, is that the results came out the same in both cases.
They came out the same. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
So they don't really change based on
all right,
on which message we used.
thank you.
And then our next question was from Liz with LA Public Press. I know this might not be part of the polling, but can you talk about how these results compare to support on these issues in the past?
I mean, I think we've seen in over time and several years ago, council expansion did not have this level of support. I don't know that I could cite specific polling numbers, but I think it's pretty clear that this is maybe a different time in the way voters are thinking about this issue than it was the last time, as Rob mentioned, charter reform in the late 90s. I think independent redistricting has always been pretty popular, whether you're talking about the state or the city. Democracy dollars, Trent might have a better feel for how that's polled in other communities. I don't know that I have historical trends here in LA. Trent, I don't know if you could speak to any of how that proposal's done in other communities. And we're not hearing you. I don't know if you're
Right. I don't know what the polling was in Seattle or Oakland, but Oakland's measure that, like the measure that we tested here, also had several other reforms like increased disclosure and the lobbying restrictions. It passed with 74% of the vote. So that's kind of in line with the 70% that we saw for that measure that we tested here. I don't know that democracy dollars have been polled in Los Angeles previously to this, though.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of it anyways.
The other question from Jamie York was, with PDI, did you use 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5?
Yeah, so
elections? Just curious how you define
their
that.
universes are a little more nuanced than that. So it's, I don't know how to describe it other than to say it's PDI universe 24P9B. I don't know if that probably doesn't mean anything to a lot of people, but it's not as detailed as people who vote 3 or 4 of the last 5 elections, because we're talking about a general election, presidential turnout. This is the one that people who don't vote any other time come out to vote for. So we don't need to be as restrictive as people who voted in the midterm primary or something like that. This is a broader universe. It's a relatively high turnout universe and also includes some newly registered voters. We can always follow up with the details of how that universe is defined if that's helpful, but they're just a little more nuanced than the kind of straight, how many times did you vote in the last number of elections?
And to just backtrack a little bit to previous question on previous results, I blanking on specific number at the moment, but there were 2 questions sent to voters in 1999. One on should we increase the size of council from 15 to 21 and 15 to 23. Both of those failed. I believe they got like 33, 36% support. So it wasn't close at all. There was a question from Carolina Goodman in the chat. Do we have feedback from the registrar of voters regarding reorganizing the ballot for ranked choice voting? That is something that would take a bit of a process. The registrar recently provided a report to the city of Burbank on how they could implement ranked choice voting, and the short answer was we could do that, but we wouldn't get started until you actually officially passed it. And it would probably take some time for us to get our hardware, retooled, and there would be some cost as far as implementation. But the short answer is yes, we could do it, but it would probably cost you a little bit of money in the short term, and it would take us some time. So those are kind of unpredictable variables. I think with the city the size of Los Angeles, we're a big client. If we were asking instead of Burbank, no offense to Burbank, I think the registrar might have to take it a little bit seriously. So beyond those costs, I think it's very important to acknowledge that, it's not as though going to ranked choice voting and eliminating primaries just means we get like free money flowing upon us. We will have savings, but there is going to be additional cost beyond what might be coming on the registrar's end. There's just an inherent cost that we would have to willingly embrace as far as civic education. The city of New York, when they switched to ranked choice voting, most people found it to go pretty smoothly. As far as people being familiar and able to handle the ballot, they spent about $10 million, if I recall correctly. So, a city of LA size, we would probably at least having to cough up, $5-6 million, maybe 10 over a couple election cycles to make sure everybody fully kind of understood what was coming. Liz, you've got your hands up. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey, so yeah, I just wanted to ask for any thoughts on ranked choice voting and support for it in the past as well.
You were breaking up a little bit. I believe you said you were curious about support for ranked choice voting in the past. From a policy perspective, I know that this was something that came up during conversations with the Municipal Reform Commission that looked at our charter 10 years ago. They ultimately ended up not embracing ranked choice voting and said, let's move to the state and federal election cycle, because that is much more likely to increase voter participation. It wasn't necessarily a knock on ranked choice voting, just the reality that ranked choice voting would likely have a significantly smaller impact in boosting voter turnout. And that's really undeniable, just looking at how we've gone from 20-25% turnout to being around 50% turnout in our elections. Of course, that is to say when they are regularly scheduled. If you have a special election, that could be anywhere from 12 to 38%. Who knows? Liz, if you have any follow-up, please feel free to step in. We are at 11:04. So if you have any last burning questions on this, please get them out now.
Mike Bonin, good morning. Nice to see you.
I just want to, as we close this thing out, I would love to just give a thorough embrace and shout out to Councilmember Bonin. It's been really weird and hard organizing at City Hall, and for so many years was really like the only shining star on there and giving some motivation to keep going through. And he was absolutely essential in a really important reform to our matching funds program, because council was trying to double the barriers to entry and make it much harder for grassroots challengers to run for office. And we appealed to him, begged him, and said, look, this is big. And he's like, I really care about full public financing and not this matching fund stuff, but I get it. And we made the case that, we've got 2 women on our council right now. We got to do better than that. We have uncompetitive elections where there hasn't been an incumbent that's been defeated by a challenger in 15 years. And in that time since, we've tripled the number of women on our council. We have seen 3 incumbents get defeated by grassroots challengers who had minimal resources in comparison. We saw the controller, Kenneth Mejia, defeat a longtime established political figure when the fundraising was quite lopsided in the 200,000 to 100,000 range. But that was because he had $800,000 in public matching funds. So I just wanted to give a particular shout out to Councilmember Bonin, someone near and dear to all of our hearts, and we all really miss him on the council and are just so happy to see him not in that place anymore, because it is a very weird place. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep on doing this stuff, but seeing folks like Councilmember Hernandez, who've tried to carry that torch, it's those little things are very important. So Councilmember, if you would love to grace us with a few words, I'm sure there is a room full of folks who would love to hear from you.
Thanks. This is impromptu, but I haven't been out of office long enough that I will turn down an opportunity to say a few words. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate the work everybody has been doing. Rob really identified the importance of the matching fund reform, and the proof of the significance of it is in the composition of the elected officials in the city right now. And it's a model and a reform a lot of people want to replicate in smaller cities around the county. But I'm really, really thrilled to see the results of this poll. Thank you to John and his team for doing this. People in Los Angeles are very clearly hungry for a better way of doing things. They're hungry for more transparency, for more ethics, for more responsive government. And what these poll results show is that they have a hefty appetite for the whole menu of reforms that we're talking about. So, I am no longer on the council and will not be able to vote to put this on the ballot. But as you know, I'm finding ways to stay engaged. And this is one of the issues that I will stay engaged on. These reforms are really important, and I hope we can get this stuff on the ballot. And once we do, I will be happy to stay engaged in the campaign to get the stuff approved. So thanks. And particularly excited about democracy vouchers. Did a podcast episode on it with Mike and with Teresa Mosqueda up in Seattle. And it's a fascinating program that made some significant reforms there, and really something we could build on here. Thanks, Rob.
And I also got to just give a big plug for the podcast. I used to hate podcasts, but then I got a dog and had a lot of free time while walking. So I got hooked on the LA pod, listened through the whole thing, and I took a little break and I was just like stranded. And I turned to Mike Bonin's podcast, and beyond all of the subjects he covers, I really did love the series he did with CD6 candidates, asking, not necessarily trying to rattle them and interrogate them, but really asking important questions to understand candidates where they come from, what's motivating them, how they approach issues. Really great stuff. And I know he's doing one with the candidates that are seeking to replace Adam Schiff for Congress. And I just thought that was extremely helpful, being able to hear his interviews with all of the candidates, compare their responses, what they didn't want to respond to, or what they responded to in a cute way, all really revealing. So just want to give that podcast a plug, and congrats on your fellowship. And we are coming up at 11:10. So I want
Rob, just so people know, it's called What's Next Los Angeles, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you. Very
Thanks.
important to plug that part of it. I just go on the thing and I search Mike Bonner. But with that, I want to just turn it over to Trent. If you have any last words, or Adam, John, as we close things out.
Well, Rob, you mentioned fewer women in office. Women candidates are polling very strongly in every jurisdiction we are polling for these 2024 elections. So you're going to see more women in every office coming up, I think.
I would just note that there was a study by the Mount St. Mary's back after Garcetti took office, looking at the state of women in office, and they found that women won elected office for the city of Los Angeles at the same rate men did, but men made up 80% of the candidates. So it really is just a matter of being able to get more women running for office. And I know Emerge California does amazing stuff in trying to make sure there's the infrastructure and resources for them to learn how to handle something like that, because it can be a whole lot more intimidating than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Adam, Trent.
I'll just say I want to completely second your everything laudatory you said about Councilmember Bonin. Thank you again, Councilmember Bonin, for everything that you did. It was so great to work with you to get the matching funds. We know that and your long support of clean money. We wanted to get full public funding at that time also. At least we got this. But these poll results show that is possible, and especially with a full public funding option, that can really make a difference along with these other reforms. Really grateful to work with John and Adam, and then LA for Democracy Voucher spearheading the whole democracy voucher part, and all the other groups like Represent Us and the League of Women Voters, et cetera, that we've been working with. So thank you all. More to come.
And I'll just add a final thank you to everybody who both participated today and participated in helping to make the poll a reality. It's a great project to be able to be a part of, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you.
Yes.
Beautiful. And just as I said before, you can find the full poll results at that link I just dropped in the chat. We're going to hope to get a link to the YouTube video by the end of the day. And if there's any media that are looking for quotes, we will be sending out a press release later in the day with some reactions from coalition members and others, including former council member Mike Bonin. So with that, once again, thank you, everybody. And I hope you